saying I'm handing it over to you for Q&A, or what would you like me to say when I'm done?
Yeah, I'll manage the Q&A. I'll have been reading whatever people are asking.
Okay, sounds good.
Steve should have read some of these. Should I be starting the webinar, or should I
Are you asking me, Steve, or is there another Steve?
Oh, sorry, Steve Walton.
There's a bunch of participants in.
You do see participants?
I can. It says like 36.
Why do you see them, but I don't see them for some reason?
So I can't see their names. I can just see like the total.
Where do you see that? Under participants?
Yeah, the icon for participants. And when I click on it, I can see 8 panelists where I can't see the names, and now 31 attendees are in the waiting room.
They're in the waiting room.
Interesting. I see the 8 panelists, but only 1 attendee.
Just want to let you know that we've got the little slate going, so we are ready to go whenever you are. So I'll wait for you, Raul, to kind of give the little countdown. I'm gonna mute myself though, my video and whatnot. But
Okay.
anybody, feel free to chat me at any time. If you need something, if you're lonely, whatever it is, give me a chat. I'll be around. Okay.
All right, I'm gonna get things set up now, y'all, and I'm gonna start the webinar. Okay. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, just so you know, if you're off video, no one's gonna see you. So only if you're on video. So if you're not up right now, feel free to go off video. Let's see. Please go off Welcome, folks. Welcome. We're just letting folks filter in before we get started. Thanks for being here. Just one more minute, we'll get started. Okay, everybody, thank you for joining us tonight. Greetings, my name is Dr. Raul Fernandez. I'm the Executive Director of Brookline for Racial Justice and Equity, also known as BRJE. I want to welcome you to our event, Race and Policy in Brookline. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us. Tonight, you'll be the first to see the findings of our inaugural community survey conducted in partnership with the MassINC Polling Group. We'll also be joined by a panel of local experts sharing their insights in response to the survey results. Now, before we continue, I wanted to make sure that we begin with an acknowledgement of the original inhabitants of this land, adapted from the one created by Brookline's Indigenous Peoples Celebration Committee. As we gather today, let us take a moment to acknowledge the history of this land we call Brookline. This is the unceded land of the Massachusetts people whose traditions, language, and stewardship continue today through their lineal descendants, the Massachusetts tribe of Ponkapog. Today, we are living on land that was taken by force. By 1641, the colonists in Brookline had allocated to themselves almost all land that had been inhabited by indigenous people. Land was not the only theft that occurred, lives were also stolen. Historical records state that in 1675, 7 indigenous men were sold into slavery in the Caribbean by residents of the area that we now call Brookline. The 7 men represent part of the early slave trade. Slavery in Brookline continued and grew, but soon those enslaved were African or of African descent. By 1764, enslavers claimed ownership of over half of all Brookline land. We acknowledge that the land, culture, and lives and the ensuing enslavement of indigenous and African peoples that occurred here. These early policies set the stage for centuries of systemic racism. As we remember these atrocities, we must commit ourselves to address the ongoing inequities that are the result of our history of colonialism and racism. Although we as individuals were not perpetrators of these atrocities, we benefit from these systems, and thus we dedicate ourselves to addressing them today. For those wishing to go beyond acknowledgement to action, you can get involved in supporting the Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda, which seeks to honor Indigenous Peoples Day statewide, and to protect Native American heritage, remove racist mascots, celebrate and teach Native American culture and history, and educate Native youth. You can also support the North American Indian Center of Boston, or NACOB, which is a nonprofit that's focused on empowering and investing in the Native American community. We're proud that NACOB's board president, Jean-Luc Perit, also serves as a member of our board. Before we go on, we'd love to see who's in the room. So I am going to go ahead and just launch a poll. There you go. And you can feel free to do those 4 short questions, hit submit, and I'm going to go ahead with my remarks. So I'll give you, enough time to do that. We'd love to see who's in the room. I'd also like to express some gratitude. I want to thank the town of Brookline and the Brookline Select Board, whose generous support through the American Rescue Plan ARPA funds made our survey possible. Thanks also to Steve Walter, Heather Hamilton, and the team from Brookline Interactive Group for live streaming tonight's event. Thanks to all of our board members for their commitment to this cause and to our families who support this important work. Finally, immense gratitude to the generous donors who have helped amplify our efforts, including many in attendance today. A number of you have made a donation while getting your ticket for this event. Thank you. If you haven't contributed or would like to, you can use this link, which will also drop in the chat. Every amount helps power our work, so thank you for that. We at BRJE believe that eliminating racism is possible, but only with the support and active participation of community members like you who will prioritize this effort in your own work while supporting our efforts to reshape policy and practice to create a Brookline where everyone can thrive. Tonight's event will take place in 3 acts. We're currently at the start of the first act, a brief presentation from me about BRJE's history, mission, and theory of change. Our second act will feature a presentation on our survey results by Steve Koczela of the MassINC Polling Group. And our third and final act will feature our panelists responding to the survey results and to your questions. You can submit questions anytime for me, MassINC Polling Group, or our panelists throughout the event using the Q&A feature on Zoom. So, who is Brookline for Racial Justice and Equity? We are a group of people who live, work, study, shop, worship, and visit in Brookline, who believe racism in our community and beyond is an unacceptable condition. We also believe that it's possible to eliminate racism in Brookline, and that doing so requires you to also believe that it's possible. We envision an accessible, inclusive Brookline where everyone here can thrive free of racism and oppression. And we believe that we'll get there by building an informed, motivated, and organized constituency for racial justice, while leveraging our collective power to reshape the systems around us. Racism doesn't just impact interpersonal relationships. Systemic and institutional racism have a detrimental impact on entire communities, negatively impacting health, economic mobility, education, and more. This impact is evident across our community today. As one example, the median income for Black households in Brookline is $47,000 less than white households. Meanwhile, unemployment rates for Latina residents are nearly double those of white residents in Brookline. And Asian residents? Well, Asian residents are 18% of Brookline's population, but hold less than 5% of seats on Brookline's boards, committees, and commissions. And of the 255 town meeting seats, you don't need one hand to count the number of Asian members in town meeting. And we have still never had an Asian select board member. Well, we've had one Latino select board member, you're looking at him, and one Black select board member who continues to serve. But when it comes to representation, we are stuck in the last century. Barriers like these create lifelong and intergenerational disparities that impair the ability of people of color to attain stability, access new opportunities, and create thriving communities. Further, systemic racism impacts everyone in this community, whether they identify as people of color or not. For example, Brookline's housing affordability crisis is rooted in restrictive practices like redlining, a policy that led to disinvestment in Black and immigrant communities and reinforced racial segregation. Those policies have made living in Brookline and certainly owning a home virtually unattainable for working class people of any race, but especially communities of color that have been locked out of wealth creation by racist housing and other economic policies. That's why today, of all the homes owned in Brookline, just 1% have a Black head of household. But that number is not cast in stone. There are remedies that we can employ to address this problem. For instance, in 2019, Brookline Town Meeting passed a home rule petition to allow for a modest real estate transfer fee to be assessed on property sales, with the proceeds going to our Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which can be used to build or preserve affordable housing or to provide rental assistance for those who need it. That bill and others like it, which passed at municipalities around the Commonwealth, has languished at the State House. And what has been the impact of that inaction? At the time when we passed the home rule petition in 2019, a mere $10 million had gone into our Affordable Housing Trust over the previous 21 years. I recently asked our town assessor, Rashid Baloshin, to provide an update on how much we would have raised had the legislature approved our home rule petition shortly after we passed it. And here's what he came up with. In the first year alone, 2020, we would have raised more than $18 million, then more than $20 million the following year, another $18 million the year after, and a paltry 14 plus million last year because of the dip in home sales. And in January of this year alone, almost $1 million. In total, that's more than $72 million that Brookline has potentially missed out on due to legislative inaction. $72 million and counting. Money which could renovate our public housing, build new permanently affordable homes, and the kinds of social and workforce housing that I hear elected leaders talk about all the time. Meanwhile, according to the Brookline Foundation's recent Understanding Brookline report, the percentage of people who identify as Black in Brookline has dropped, falling from just 3.4% in 2010 to a mere 2.5% in 2020. We're heading in the wrong direction, folks, but we can turn it around. Addressing these issues and eliminating racism will require bold solutions that build community, advance racially just policies, expand access and opportunities, and provide pathways for every community member to participate in the civic and social fabric of Brookline. So where does BRJE come in? BRJE is a direct response to the urgent need to eliminate the barriers that are preventing everyone in the Brookline community from reaching their full potential. We have nearly 10 years of experience working with and alongside Brookline community organizations and institutions. We started as a community organization, primarily focused on the schools. In the past, we met regularly with superintendents, the head of BHS, the DEI staff when they were added, and we advocated for unleveling as well as critical programs like ACE. But we recognized that the issues we needed to tackle in our community were bigger and more intersectional, and that we needed to get more organized to have the kind of impact we envision. So we established ourselves as a 501c3 nonprofit. We secured ARPA funding through the town, and we're in the process of relaunching Bridge with a new strategy that aims to end racism in Brookline in our lifetime through a powerful three-pronged approach. First, to increase access to essential resources like food, housing, childcare, early education, and more by reducing costs and eliminating restrictive barriers. Second, to ensure inclusion in local decision and policymaking by removing roadblocks to civic participation and enforcing civil rights protections. And third, to advance opportunities so that the environmental health and educational benefits of Brookline are maximized for people of color while creating new pathways to economic mobility. And here's our playbook. We're focused on building strong, loving, and mutually supportive relationships between and among communities of color and allies in Brookline. Educating Brookline residents on the negative impacts of racial inequities and the merits of racially just policies and practices. Increasing the representation of people of color and racial justice allies in leadership and decision-making roles. Working in partnership with local government and community organizations to design and implement racially just policies and practices. Amplifying voices of communities of color, motivating allies toward action, and pressing leaders on matters of racial justice. And finally, holding our community accountable for making measurable progress by conducting research and sharing data on key metrics. Drawing on our roots as a community-led coalition, our work will be driven by coalition building events, community education, original research, policy development, and outcomes assessment that leverages the core strengths of Brookline to build an engine of change. Our board of directors is composed predominantly of people of color working alongside dedicated white allies, all committed to ensuring that our actions result in measurable progress that can be felt by those who need it most. We're also in the process of recruiting new board members, and you can indicate your interest on the follow-up survey that we'll be sending you. So that's us. I'll respond to your questions, any questions you have through the Q&A, but I just want to reiterate how important it is that we come together across sectors to address and eliminate racial inequities. Town government can't do it alone. The schools can't do it alone. The faith community can't do it alone. The business community can't do it alone. And the nonprofit sector sure as heck can't do it alone. It's going to take all of us, whether we're usually focusing our activism on climate change or housing density or ending anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or transphobia. It's going to take all of us coming together in an intersectional way to make the change we want to see in our community and beyond. So with that, I'll take any questions you have through the Q&A, and I'll respond to those there. But I'd like to begin our second act with and invite Steve Casella with the MassINC Polling Group to share the findings of our survey. Steve, I'm going to stop sharing, and the floor will be yours. Make sure you unmute.
Sorry, I said thank you, Aurora, and I just said I like any meeting that starts with a poll. So appreciate it and appreciate the opportunity to be here. I see some familiar names, people I know in the participant list, and for those I don't know, my name is Steve Casella, and I am the president of the MassINC Polling Group. We've done a survey on behalf of Bridge, and I am going to share the results here in a set of PowerPoint slides briefly, and then would invite anybody that has questions, either go ahead and drop them in the chat during or after the presentation, and I'd be glad to answer those. I also have a colleague with me, Olivia Wine, who is also going to be able to answer some of the questions during the presentation if anyone has questions on how the poll is done or anything like that that she could address. So just a little bit about the survey that we're going to be talking about. First of all, for those of you who got it and recognized it and responded to it, a big hearty thank you from the MassINC Polling Group on behalf of our friends at Bridge. We really do appreciate it. The survey was done in March and April. It was conducted in 3 languages. It was done, as many of you probably saw in your mailboxes, both by mail, where you could take an online survey, and also for those of you who answered the phone version, it was also done by landline and cell phone, and finally by an online survey, which was delivered by text message. The data that you're going to be looking at is representative of the population of Brookline. We weighted to make sure that it was so. And you can see the factors that we weighted on. race, age, gender, education, and geography. And the project, of course, is sponsored by BRJE. Big hearty thank you to them. Take a brief look at the key findings, but then we're going to spend more time on them as we actually get into the data itself. So, we won't pause on this slide for too long, but just very quickly, the thing that the data really highlights is something that Raul touched on, which is basically that Brookline is facing an affordability crisis. And it's affecting the people the most, who we'll see when we get to the civic engagement portion of the survey, are the least able to engage and say that they engage the least with local government, community meetings, all the different things, all the different ways that Brookline residents can participate in their community. The people who are affected the most by the problems that the survey uncovers are also the least engaged, the least able to sort of participate and share their voice and raise their voice in those processes. Probably not surprisingly to anybody on this call, housing was by far the most commonly cited issue in the survey as far as the issues that are facing Brookline right now. That comes up over and over again kind of throughout the survey. We found that most residents support a range of different kinds of housing developments, different types of housing, different ways of describing it, and also support rent control. And we'll see the demographics of how those break out as well. Looking at racism specifically, we found most people see it as at least a somewhat serious problem. There's not a lot of consensus on directionality of it, whether it's better or worse than it was a few years ago. But certainly there's a consensus, or there's at least a majority who say that it's at least somewhat of a serious problem at the moment. And then, as I kind of touched on up top, of course, the people who do participate the most tend to be the people who have lived in Brookline the longest. People who own homes, live in higher income households, and are older residents. So let's get into the data. The first question, and I just point out for anybody following along, all the question text, the original question text is at the bottom of the slide. So if you're curious how the question was worded or what we actually asked, that's where that is. And this one was, please tell me whether you agree or disagree with the statement. It's getting harder for me to afford to live in Brookline. And you can see that overall, we've got 69%, or I should say 68%, saying that they strongly agree or somewhat agree that it is getting harder for them to afford to live in Brookline, whereas only 30% either somewhat or strongly disagree. So the next question was an open-ended question where we asked on an open-ended basis what people think was the most important issue facing Brookline right now. And then all the things that you all wrote, that residents wrote, we analyzed them and grouped them into categories, which you can see described here. And then just the percent of people who identified each one is what you're looking at here. So 44% of poll respondents said housing, which was far and away more than any of the other issues that were identified in the poll. And I'd also say that people could mention more than one. So if it doesn't add up perfectly to 100, that is why. There were some demographic differences in terms of who mentioned what, and we pulled out who mentioned housing specifically. And you can see that overall, the number was 44%. That's the same number you were just looking at in the last slide. But then when you look at it across demographic groups, you can see that there was very different frequencies in terms of the percentage of people, for instance, who rent. 57% of them said housing was the most important issue, compared to 37% of homeowners who said the same thing. Not terribly surprising, of course. If you want to stay, you want to buy, then housing is a much more important issue to you. And rents in Brookline and all across the Boston region are very high. So that of course makes sense. Renters, of course, intersect with residents who are the newest, which is what you see in this next set of bars right here, with those who have lived in Brookline the shortest amount of time, saying that housing affordability is a bigger issue. And of course, the further and further down you get here, you've got residents who already own their own home, and in many cases have owned it for a long time. You also see in the split by income, with residents in houses with incomes under $100,000 much more likely to call affordability an issue. And then you can see by race, you have Black and Latino and white residents actually all kind of agreeing that it's getting harder to live in, agreeing in terms of the frequency that they mentioned housing on an open-ended basis. So looking specifically then at some of the word-for-word things that people said, you can see an illustration of what we were just talking about. The rents are too high, just keep going up and up, push out all the working class / middle. Then you can see some of the other issues that people mentioned, such as racial inclusion, racial equity, rising taxes, public schools, childcare. We'll see childcare come up a couple times, diversity and reputation, and then one for the condition of sidewalks and streets. So then the question was, which 3 initiatives do you think would be most helpful in creating pathways to help people in Brookline get ahead economically? And here again, we have housing as number 1, with 65% choosing that. This was a choose 3. So again, you've got it adding up to much more than 100%, but 65% for housing. Next up was affordable childcare and universal pre-K, definitely closely related items there. And we'll see those kind of touched on again as we go forward. Some that were mentioned less frequently, we had job training, financial assistance for low-income individuals, expanded healthcare access, supporting development for businesses owned by people of color, and so forth. So again, breaking out the previous question demographically, this is the percent who on the 3 initiatives question said that basically housing would be most helpful. We see women a bit more likely to say so, and you'll see there's a gender difference on several of the questions coming up. I think a lot of that has to do with just political leanings. We also see a difference by income, which makes sense when we're thinking about people trying to stay in Brookline, trying to buy in Brookline, trying to put down the roots in Brookline, whereas people in upper income groups are more likely to already be homeowners, for instance. And we see that same difference here. One of the housing policies we asked about was rent control, and here are the results on that. Basically, when we ask about rent control in Brookline, which was, as we phrased it, which is a policy that would limit how much landlords can raise rent, we see 63% overall saying that they strongly or somewhat support that proposal. Very, very big difference, not surprisingly, between renters and homeowners. It looks like 86%, should never add on screen, but I'll try it here. 86% of renters saying that they would strongly or somewhat support rent control compared to 48% of homeowners. We also see Black and Latino residents, 89% support there. You also see a majority of white residents and a majority of API residents saying that they would support a proposal of rent control. On the income split, you've got majority support in both groups, though households under $100,000 are much more likely to say so. Again, you've got women more likely to say so, and newer residents of Brookline also more likely to offer support for rent control. We also asked about development of a couple different descriptions or kinds of housing, and asked people to rate how they'd feel about more of each kind being developed in Brookline. And this is exactly how they were described. Affordable housing, housing for people in low-wage jobs, mixed income housing, high-density housing. We can see that the top 3 actually get majorities saying they would strongly support the development of each of these 3. It's not like people are opposed to high-density housing. You still see a pretty strong majority when you add in your somewhat supports. But the top 3, particularly saying affordable housing, we see 2/3 saying that they strongly support that proposal. So definitely support for concrete proposals as well. We also then broke that out by race and found that just to orient you to the numbers, these should look familiar. These are the strongly support numbers from the previous slide. And then you can see that they're pretty close to the overall numbers for white residents. Black and Latino residents, much more likely on some of them, a little more likely on others. API residents, particularly, a bit less likely actually than either group to say that they would support development of any of these types of housing. I should just pause and note there, though, that you still have majorities, and this is just the strongly support numbers. So it's not opposition, it's just less likely to say they strongly support. So then the question here was whether or not people think residents of Brookline have similar access to each of the following, regardless of their race or not. And the numbers that you see here are the percent who say that people think that they do not have similar access regardless of race. So it's basically who sees the biggest inequities, or where are the biggest inequities seen. You can see that 70% do not feel that way about housing that's affordable. 58% overall say that they don't about childcare that's affordable, and so forth and so on. Then as you kind of scan across, you can see Black or Latino residents are more likely to say that residents don't have equal access to housing that's affordable, or childcare that's affordable, or political representation. And then the gaps get a bit smaller as you kind of work your way down. Similarly, you have a bit of a difference on gender, where you have women less likely to say that residents have equal access to any of the things that are listed in this table. This question was just about race. It was about how serious of a problem you think racism is in Brookline. And we see overall 56% say that they think it's either very or somewhat serious. That's this top bar here, with the dark bar being the very serious, and then the next one saying somewhat serious. You can see that there is a difference, with Black or Latino residents more likely to say that they think it is either very or somewhat serious compared to white residents or AAPI residents. But you still have across the board a majority of each group saying that they think it's at least a somewhat serious problem. And you see now, which should by now be kind of a familiar dynamic, women more likely to say that they think it's a serious problem compared to men. In terms of directionality, there's not a ton of consensus on this one. This one is basically whether race relations are getting better or worse, or if they've stayed about the same over the last 5 years. And you can see that you've got about the same number saying better as worse. You've got about half saying stayed about the same, and then a fifth saying they don't know. So you could describe it in kind of any way you wanted. You know, most people think it's getting better or about the same. Most people think it's getting worse or about the same. So I think that the main thing you could take away from this is that there's not a strong feeling in any particular direction, or not a consensus about which direction race relations in Brookline are heading over the last 5 years. This question was about how each group is doing at reducing disparities in Brookline. And we listed out the groups that you see here in the chart. And then you can see it goes from excellent, good, fair, poor, and then you've got a lot in each group that say they just don't know. Particularly, for instance, for community health organizations, faith-based organizations, business community, it's a third or more, and 4 of the items saying that they just don't know. But overall, among those who do know, the group that does the best is the public schools, where 46% said that they thought the public schools in Brookline were doing either excellent or good, followed by healthcare providers at 41%, and so on and so forth. It's less than half on all of the groups, so I wouldn't say there's, again, not a lot of consensus on this question about which groups are doing a particularly good job. You've just got too many people who say they don't know about each one, don't have direct contact, don't interact, maybe don't know what each of these groups are up to on this issue. So there's nobody that everybody kind of knows is doing a great job at this. So sticking then a bit with public schools, which is at the top of the chart that we're looking at right now, we also asked about the idea of unleveled courses, and found overall 37% said that they would either strongly or somewhat support the idea of unleveled courses. If you're curious about how that question was phrased and the information that was offered, you can see again that that's displayed at the bottom of the chart. We see 48% saying they either somewhat or strongly oppose that as a proposal. There's a big difference that sticks out if you kind of look down the chart, where you've got Black or Latino residents much more likely to support this idea than are white residents or AAPI residents. Among Black or Latino residents, you have about 60% compared to under 40% for both white residents and AAPI residents. So sticking for a second then with the idea of who's doing well at reducing disparities. This question actually, or this chart, I should say, actually looks at the percent who say that each group is doing poorly at reducing disparities, just to kind of get a sense of the other end, who thinks the groups are doing poorly. And we see Black or Latino residents are more likely than our white residents to say that each of the groups listed on this chart are doing poorly. You also see one that sticks out in the middle, or a couple that stick out in the middle column, are AAPI residents are more likely to say that local government is doing poorly, and also more likely than our white residents to say the public schools are not doing well on this issue. We also wanted to ask a bit about, I shouldn't say we wanted to, we did ask a bit about solutions. and wanted to pitch it in a way or pose it in a way which made clear that this meant resources would either come from somewhere else or it would mean increasing taxes. And you can see the two ways that the questions were phrased here, kind of at the bottom left of the slide. And then the percents are the percent who say that they would support each of these ideas, even if it meant either shifting resources from other programs or increasing taxes. That's the dark red versus the pink bar here. And you can see these are just your strongly supports. They actually, the somewhat supports are add another, add more points to each one of these. But I think not surprisingly, by this point in the presentation, more affordable housing is number one. And you see 67% saying that they would support that, even if it means shifting resources from other programs, and 58% even if it means increasing taxes. Dealing with food insecurity is another one where you see majority strong support in both instances, and childcare options is another one where just very high levels of support for all of these. I should also add that if you want to see even more data about any demographic group you're interested in, or exactly how all these different tables looked or where they appeared in the questionnaire, all this data will be posted on the website, and I'd invite you to take a look at it there as well. Okay, so this is digging into the question that we just showed on the previous slide about shifting resources a bit more, and basically taking the same percents that we just looked at. You see those on this slide in the overall column, and then breaking them out to see, okay, how do white residents, API residents, and Black or Latino residents feel about each of these proposals? And you can see that on some of them, there's pretty much agreement. You've got a lot of agreement here, kind of in the top two items, where affordable housing and dealing with food insecurity, there's a lot of agreement on those. Black Latino residents are more likely to support a broader range of initiatives. So for instance, 77% strongly support for expanding childcare options. Then you've got 59% for white and API residents on the same item. And then you kind of can look down at the next three and see kind of the same pattern on each one of those. Looking at basically the same table, except on the question where we posed it as raising taxes, you see a fairly similar kind of trend with Black or Latino residents more likely to say that they support each one of the initiatives that were proposed in the question, with the exception here at the bottom of helping homeowners avoid foreclosure. But overall, you see more support among Black or Latino residents of Brookline. But here too, you've got half or more of white residents saying that they strongly support this idea. And of course, if you were to add the somewhat support, all of these would be well into the majority territory. So one of the things Raul mentioned up front, of course, is political engagement. And that's what the last few slides here deal with. And the question here is, how engaged do you feel with community events or activities in Brookline? And basically the dark bar is very engaged, and the pink bar here is the percent who say that they feel somewhat engaged. And then the next couple after this is we'll get more into politics specifically. But even here you can see newer residents of Brookline, those who have been there 3 years or less, are far less likely to say that they feel engaged. Those with lower incomes a bit less likely, younger folks a bit less likely, and renters a bit less likely to say that they feel engaged by the city of Brookline, or I should say, in events or activities in the town of Brookline. Okay, so then who feels like they have a voice in the decision-making processes in Brookline? That's what this next slide is here. And you can see basically that the blue bars sticking off here to the right are the ones who say, yes, they do feel like they have a voice. The red bars sticking over to the left are those who say they don't. So overall, you see 38% say yes, 47% say no, and 15% don't know. So certainly not a majority, or really close to a majority of respondents said that they think that they do have a voice in decision-making processes in Brookline. That as you kind of go down between some of the demographic groups, you can see that more homeowners feel that way by a fairly wide margin, 47% compared to 28%. Longer time residents, a trend or sort of a dynamic, which again should look pretty familiar by now. Much more likely to say yes compared to residents who've been in Brookline for a shorter amount of time. Residents with more education, older residents are each more likely to say that they feel that they have a voice in the city of Brookline. Not actually a ton of difference in terms of how residents feel when you look at it by race, with 38% of Black or Latino residents, 45% of AAPI residents, and 36% of white residents saying that they do feel like they have a voice. Then looking at how residents have actually engaged, we asked a much longer series of items here, and I would encourage you to go look at the whole thing if you're interested. We just kind of picked took the 4 most common things that people said that they did, just because this chart would have even more numbers on it if we looked at every single thing. And then broke it out by different demographic groups in terms of race, age, income, et cetera, duration in Brookline, and so forth. And then the percents that you see are the percents who say, yes, they have done each of these in the last 2 years. Voted in an election, not surprisingly, by far the most common thing. Some people will have voted in other towns and other places because they've moved into Brookline, for instance. We see contacted an elected official at 45%, donated to a campaign or candidate at 39%, and so forth. But then as you start to kind of look across, you can see that there are some differences that start to appear. You've got, for instance, older residents, not surprisingly, as we've kind of seen, more likely to say that they have done each one of these things. You can see that when we're looking at attending government meetings, Black or Latino residents are less likely to say that they've done this over the last couple of years. You can see when you look at income, when you look at the representation of who's at public meetings, who has donated, who's contacted elected officials, it's much more likely to be residents who live in households with 6-figure incomes rather than those who live in households with lower levels of income than that. Elected officials are far more likely to hear from longtime residents. That's what these 3 columns here show, with 50% of residents who have been there over 15 years saying yes, they've contacted an elected official in the last 2 years, compared to just 31% of newer residents. Same dynamic with donating to candidates, same with attending government meetings, and so forth. Same dynamic between owners and renters, and those with children are also more likely to do each one of those activities. So it's just important to emphasize that when you're looking at you're sort of looking at who you're hearing from when you're having public meetings, or you're reading your email and so forth as an elected official. It's not necessarily representative of the full town's population. And someone has pointed out that I appear to have made a typo on the less or more than 45, and you are correct. There is a typo. That's the less than greater than sign should be in the other direction. But that is a whirlwind tour through some of the results. Again, I really encourage you to take a look at the further results, and they're posted on our website. Then I'll turn it back over to Raul for any questions.
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. I'll note before we get to questions that your colleague Olivia Wine has mentioned in the chat that poll results are going to be posted at 9 p.m. on the page that's listed there in the chat, and also in response to a question about the respondents and how they were chosen. You all should be able to see the Q&A there, but I'll just read it out so for everybody. The poll was 508 residents in total. MassINC began by mailing to 10,000 households, chosen both randomly and by block group, and then used a random sample for the calls and the texts. So hopefully that clarifies that. We're starting to see some questions in the chat. Please get those in there. As those questions populate, I wanted to start by asking you, Steve, throughout this process, really what you learned about Brookline while conducting the survey, and what felt familiar to you, having done many surveys across Massachusetts on similar topics, and maybe anything that was surprising.
Yeah, one thing that's very familiar from all across Massachusetts is just the level of that housing has become the issue, the #1 issue in many of the surveys that we're doing. For years and years, it was consistently education, healthcare, and the economy. Those were always the top 3, no matter how we asked the question. And then housing started to grow. For a brief time, it was COVID. COVID dominated everything. But now housing is back, and housing is kind of, at least economically, and in a lot of other ways we ask it, right up there as the number one issue. So that certainly is something that we've seen. Affordability is also certainly a key issue. And then the other thing that felt very familiar was the dynamic of who's most likely to reach out to elected officials. You know, it is certainly true at local levels. You know, a lot of the political trends that we see more broadly are exacerbated at local levels, you know, and that's certainly one of them. The people who are most likely to vote in congressional elections are, you know, get progressively older and whiter, and then the percent who vote in local elections, it just continues to get older, wealthier, and less diverse, kind of the lower to the ground you get. The thing, let's see, the things that I learned about Brookline, I think that in some ways it was the level of commonality that Brookline has with a lot of what's happening in Massachusetts, and just the issues that the rest of Massachusetts is facing just feels so familiar to what's happening in Brookline.
No. Yes, we are a beautiful, unique community, and at the same time, the issues that impact our neighbors impact us as well.
Absolutely.
And we'd be wise to pay focus to that. Let's see, we've got some questions. One by Michael. How do you account for the disparities between the number of people who say that they voted in an election with the actual number of voters in local elections?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the question was actually who'd voted in any election for the last 2 years. So certainly local turnout is often very low. You know, I ran 5,000 years ago. I ran for local office, and you know, did my best to knock on every door in the town until someone told me, you know what, it's going to be like 12% turnout. And you know, that is pretty much true everywhere. You know, sometimes there'll be a ballot initiative or something like that on the ballot, which will really, you know, crank turnout up, but typically it definitely is in the teens. But when you factor in, you know, 2022 midterms, plus all the primaries, Massachusetts primaries, local prelims and everything, it is much higher. You know, it is, and also I should say that newer residents could have voted somewhere else. It is still, it may also be true that some residents just said they voted and didn't realize that they haven't in the last couple of years, that they're remembering that they voted in 2020, for instance. But certainly 89% of people did not vote in local elections.
Thanks for that. Another question from Jessica. Will the data also be available disaggregated by gender and race rather than just gender or just race?
We could probably do that to a limited extent. And the reason for that is that at some point you start to get into sample size issues. I'd have to see exactly how many we have within each group to be able to do that. Certainly, it's something that we can often do when we have, you know, 1,000 respondents and so forth. But when we have 500, if we've got, you know, that's at a minimum going to be 6 different groups, and it just depends on how big each one was. So we'll check out the sample sizes and see how further we could disaggregate that.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. And then I'll say Marty's question is probably a question that I should address at least most of, but I do want to make sure that you know that he's a big fan of yours. So there's that, Steve.
Okay.
But I want to, if there are any other questions, now would be a good time to pop them in the chat directly regarding the survey for Steve while we have him. Steve, after this point, needs to be somewhere else. So if you have any questions about the survey, now would be a good time to do that. And otherwise, I can get to additional questions that are outside of the scope of the survey afterwards. All right. All right. Okay. So just a reminder, we've got one from Jessica here. I'll give this reminder and allow anyone else to put a question in the chat that they'd like to. All of this is going to be posted online for everyone to review, to sift through, to engage. Is that the crosstabs as well, Steve?
Yes, we'll have both the top line, which essentially what that is it's the whole questionnaire and the percent of respondents who answered each way. Then the crosstabs break things out by all the breakouts you saw, plus about 15 or 20 others. And those will all be posted this evening.
Great. So Jess has another question. Have you seen other towns with similar survey results take meaningful actions to change policy?
We haven't, honestly, this is the first local survey of this kind of depth on the issue, on this issue that we've done. So definitely, applause for Bridge and applause for Brookline for kind of taking this head on. We've done other local surveys on things like, fare free transit and, other things that definitely have led to, policy change. But an issue specifically on racial justice and equity in a municipality, there may be others. We haven't done them. I don't know of any, but certainly local surveys can result in policy because you're as close as you can possibly be to the levers of power. Whereas if it's a state survey, then you've got layers of lobbyists and legislators to go through to, before anything can get done.
Okay. Thanks for that. Joan asks about how you explain the difference in the responses. We see in some of the responses, some of the Asian respondents certainly responding differently than Black and Latino respondents, for instance, to some questions. Any ideas why those differences might exist?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a time where, as a pollster, it's best to hand the microphone to people who know better. And this may be one of those. I mean, I would observe that we often see white residents and AAPI residents closer on some issues, depending on what they are politically, and Black and Latino residents more leaning in a progressive direction. If you disaggregate white residents by political leaning, you can perhaps get a bit more nuance on that. But the why, I think, is probably for those with more expertise on that question to better answer.
Yeah. I would say too, we've discussed further research and as part of that, engaging in, we didn't get as many, for instance, Black and Latino respondents as we would have hoped to in this survey, and part of that you saw in my presentation earlier is because of the percentages of folks who live in Brookline. But there are things that we could do now that we've done the sort of generalizable, statistically significant survey, is really to go out there and engage with communities of color, and that includes the Asian population, Black and Latino populations, and others, to really start to understand a little bit more, to maybe have folks do this survey as an entry point, but also to do interviews and focus groups as well, so that we have a deeper understanding of what their experiences are like in Brookline, and to the extent that there are pain points, how we might address those. So I think that's good future work for us. Let me get this final question from Zakia, which is polling data shows high levels of dissatisfaction with local leaders' handling of racial disparities in Brookline, with only 8% giving them top marks. What are some key questions researchers should be asking to better understand this issue and inform policy changes?
Yeah, Raul, I think you hit on kind of what the task should be when there's ambiguities and sort of what the poll data is telling us on this topic, the topic of the last question, and any other topic, which is, the more you can ask residents then to use their own words and tell us what's going on, tell you what's going on, I think the better our understanding will be. In a poll, we can do our very best, listen to leaders, listen to, read the media accounts, talk to Raul and others. But at the end of the day, we have to write down the questions, and we can only ask so many. But if you want to know 10 levels deeper, kind of what's going on in people's minds, we have to talk to them. We have to do in-depth conversations. We have to, do focus groups and that sort of thing. So I think those are the kinds of things which would let people say things we may not have thought of, and bring up topics that we didn't ask about, and really, explore that in more nuance and much more depth and detail with us.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, Steve, thank you and Olivia for all of your work on this.
Thank you.
I have to say, just for everybody, it was a phenomenal experience working with the MassINC Polling Group, with Steve, with Olivia. You've been amazing partners. I can't wait to work with you all again. And so if anybody out there is looking at doing some kind of polling or surveying, whether it be in your community or beyond, think about the MassINC folks. They're really terrific to work with. We've done a poll in the past together, and I have a feeling we'll do one again together. So thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Raul.
All right. Take care, Steve. And invite our panelists to start to come on camera as well. As we do that, I want to make sure to be responsive to Marty's question as well, which others can see in there. really trying to understand what systemic racism means, whether or not it feels like systemic racism in Brookline is somehow different, or maybe better or worse than other communities, and also whether or not folks talking about racism in Brookline might actually be a hindrance to folks from communities of color perhaps moving here. By the way, Chris, I'll invite you to join us on camera as well. Deborah and Malcolm are here. Fantastic. As we enter into our panel, and maybe our panelists will have something to say about this as well. So when we think about systemic racism, we think about disproportionate outcomes, disparate outcomes based on race. We see them. I don't know that there's anyone at this point, particularly after the Great Awakening, after the murder of George Floyd, and folks paying more attention and learning much more about the way racism exists today and how it appears in systems and structures today, understanding this. But certainly we're going to talk today about disparities in housing, disparities in education, and disparities in public health. And when, taking education as an example, when you see those disparities so consistently, not just in Brookline, but also across the board, when you see those disparities persisting, even when accounting for income, even when accounting for how much folks' families make and all these other factors, and you see those racial disparities, you got to think one of two things. You got to either think there's a problem with the kids or there's a problem with the system. Our point of view is that there's a problem. There ain't no problem with the kids. The problems are with the systems, that we need to address those problems. In terms of whether or not it's worse in Brookline, as Steve said, I think every community deals with a lot of the same issues, maybe just in different ways. We're not as concerned about whether or not things are better or worse elsewhere. We're concerned about addressing racism in our own community. That's what we are, a group of people that have come together that see problems where we are and want to address those problems, and also maybe build a roadmap for how other similar communities can address those problems. And then finally, whether or not folks are exaggerating how racist Brookline is, people have different experiences. Your good experience doesn't cancel out someone else's bad experience, as I once heard a high school student say in a public forum while I was on the select board, which I thought was just so prophetic. We've all got different experiences, and to the extent that folks have issues, I think local leaders, I think folks who are engaged in the community should want to know those experiences, should want to know where the pain points are for residents, even if they're not pain points for them. And so that's what we're going to be discussing. That's what we're going to be working on as organization. If we fully respect other folks working on other issues, that's part of it. We talked about climate, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia. There's lots of other organizations that are addressing all kinds of issues that are happening in our community and beyond. This is where we're going to be gathering our support, is to make sure to address these issues around systemic racism, which, yes, we do believe exists in Brookline and beyond. So with that, I want to get our panelists invited here. Deborah Brown, who's going to come back on camera in a moment. By the way, Deborah Brown, I should say, is doing this while traveling. She is at an undisclosed airport somewhere, I think in America, could be somewhere else. I'm not even sure. So Deborah is joining us. She is the president of the Brookline Community Development Corporation. We've got Malcolm Cawthorne. You know him, you love him. He's the METCO director of the public schools of Brookline. And we also have Chris Chanyasulkit. Deborah, I'm going to ask you to just mute while you're not talking yet. We also have Chris Chanyasulkit, who's the most recent past president of the American Public Health Association, as well as town meeting member, library trustee, probably some other things I don't even know. And so wanted to welcome you all. And I also wanted to start with a question for all of you as well. And that question is this. I'd love to get your initial reactions to the survey results. In reviewing the data, was there anything you found either surprising or affirming? So we're going to actually start with Malcolm on this one, then Chris, and then we'll get Deborah. So Malcolm, why don't you get us going?
Thanks, Raul. Thanks for doing this. I think I don't know if surprising and affirming is the best way for me to respond. I think when I look and see sort of the issues of housing and how powerful that is and tied to childcare, it really is something that I think really go hand in hand, and is this vicious cycle or double-edged sword for a lot of families, right? To stay here, like multiple caregivers have to work and bring home income, which means you then have to pay for childcare. Right. And so if childcare is highly inflated and housing's highly inflated, you know, it's almost an impossibility to do both. And I think, you know, I think sometimes we've lost sight of our power to control and regulate those things, as well as the impact upon marginalized people. And so I think, you know, when my family first moved here and had to truly fight to get into the town, it wasn't about affordability. That was about race. That was them fighting to do that. And there was issues with public housing, not letting racial groups into public housing in the early 70s. But the reality was that we could actually afford to rent while my mother had another baby and stayed home with us until my sister was about preschool age. Because there wasn't such a gap in affordability. Most of the police and firefighters could live in town. And so, you know, there were other factors that were going on, but it wasn't about housing affordability. And that really blew up, particularly in the early 80s. And so I think when I look at those numbers and I see how those interact and how they hurt marginalized groups, and especially talking with folks around who say so many places in Brookline won't take vouchers for childcare and things of that nature. Yeah, I think, you know, those are systems that are working to make it really complicated for those who would want to be in this town, in this community.
Thanks, Malcolm. Chris, what do you see in the data? What's sticking out to you here? Anything surprising or anything affirming for you?
Yeah, so thank you to MassINC for doing the polling, to Bridge for sponsoring and funding it, and to all of you for having this convening. So I unfortunately didn't see too much that was surprising, just because, you know, with my position at the American Public Health Association, I've been all over the nation, and I haven't really found a place or a space where everyone's like, wow, where I live is so affordable and I love all the childcare options, and, you know, life is just beautiful. I have not seen it. You know, I've been everywhere from Alaska to North Dakota to Texas and everywhere in between. And, you know, unfortunately, I haven't found that. But what I will say that makes me so hopeful is the fact that the number of people, pardon that noise, that's my dog in the back. If you hear it. I have two dogs. I guess what I'll say that is just leaving me so optimistic and hopeful as I look at the data is that a number of people see that racism is a problem, and they recognize that, because that is, and I have to say, something that we don't really see widespread at a national level in all places and spaces and in a number of communities. And, you know, I'm sure we'll get to it later, but the American Public Health Association is all about racial equity and naming that racism as a public health crisis.
Thanks, Chris. Deborah, if you're available, come on camera. And if not, we can continue on.
I'm here.
Okay, we hear you. We don't see you, but we hear you.
All
there
right.
you go. There you go. So talk to me about, as you can, what you're seeing in this data. Anything surprising or affirming for you?
You know, I guess I didn't see anything particularly surprising. Maybe the one thing that I saw was that people were particularly not willing to help as much around rental assistance as they were around increasing the housing stock. And for me, they're kind of one and the same. If I had to think sort of more systemically about what that survey tells me, is that even though a lot of what we talk about is based in race, I tend to look at a lot of this, and pardon the background noise, as a canary in the mine. For many years, you know, it was Black people that were the primary victims of just rampant housing issues. And the system did not step up. Now a lot of people are impacted. And so I call it the canary in the mine. It's like we used to complain about environmental protection, and now everybody's concerned about climate change. And I think part of the same thing is happening around housing.
All right, we're going to get into that for sure. And I want to talk about these issues around affordability as well. In looking at the crosstabs, 68% of respondents overall and majorities of every cross-section of Brookline, residents of all races, ages, and genders, owners as well as renters, regardless of education or income level, said, yes, it's getting harder for me to afford to live in Brookline. You're all longtime Brookline residents. I'm wondering what trends you've seen regarding affordability in Brookline and how you think the forces at play have impacted communities of color here. Chris, I want to start with you on this one.
So I would say it's really hard. I mean, just things are more expensive and harder here, there, and everywhere, but also, I see it more. You can see it visibly. I mean, if you look, I think when I first came to Brookline, there was, one small food pantry site. Now there's different locations. There are lines, there's more need than they can ever really try to address, but they do their level best at the food pantry, for example. The need is great and it's really palpable. There's this amazing program called Thrives in Brookline that has a little backpack that students can take home food on Fridays so that they have snacks and food through the rest of the weekend. That's heavily used. So I say, I'm not saying things are, I guess I'm just saying like, it is worse. And I hate that because I try to be a really optimistic person. But since I've been here and over the years, when I first came here, we did clothing drives and I was a member of the Brookline Commission for Women and we had clothing drives and we had all these different fundraisers and things like that. But now the need is deeper and greater, again, the food pantry, the Thrives program, but there's a huge need. And I'm thankful that, for example, we have free school meals now, right? But then it essentially took a pandemic for people to realize that. It's hard for parents. And then I also very much, I see it in a number of different ways in that our community is so great and we try to connect with each other. A lot of us are all being all environmental, but we're also all each in need, I love these buy nothing groups on Facebook where parents are like, my kids' cleats are outgrown. Does anyone need them? And someone else needs them, things like that. But that can only go so far. I see the need as being great and it can only go so far. And so that's where, each of us as different residents step up to the level best that we can, right? But now I think we're turning to our government and the society and the systems and the structures that created these inequities and these disparities and these systems that are making the cost of food and housing and childcare so hard for families. So yeah, it's funny to think of myself as a longtime resident because I remember very clearly being new and my first time running for a town meeting and feeling very much an outsider. So I still, feel very weird to think of myself as long time, but I've seen huge changes. I mean, the need is greater, deeper, stronger. I don't know of one school or one PTO that isn't constantly in a fundraiser. It's really hard. And it's, in some ways it's great that our community tries to come together as much as we can, but it's time for the system to also help, right? Because the system created these issues that we're dealing with.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, Malcolm, we see so much of the way, at least certainly in the past anyway, that these issues have been addressed have been by nonprofits and perhaps through the schools as well, but we're not seeing a lot of government involvement in, Deborah mentioned this earlier, folks are happy to support, let's say, building more housing, but the idea of supporting individual folks who might get evicted with rental assistance is a topic of debate, for instance, right? And we see that reflected in the survey as well. So I'm wondering, what you think about, you've been here for a while as well, the trends that have happened, the forces at play and how they're impacting folks, particularly from communities of color in Brookline.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've seen that I think is really problematic is it's probably most glaring with the Black population decreasing so much over time, but I think it's also you know um, the housing we provide or build isn't really accessible for most people and most families, and certainly marginalized groups and people of color. And what that really does is means, I know we're building some more housing that's accessible, low-income families and things like that. But what that does is it really means we create a single story for particularly those folks of color who can only get into town through low-income housing. And one of the things that was not in our survey but came through the Brookline Community Foundation is, Brookline is known for its schools, and the schools are, I think in general really strong. And I think one of the things that we also know, though, is that Black population is not just decreasing in totality; it's also decreasing in those who have college or advanced degrees. And what we know in our country is that is the biggest determiner of you going to college. If you have a parent who has a college or advanced degree, that's like having a college counselor in your house. And so as we decrease like the single story of what it means to be Black and live in Brookline, we are also causing this impact of families who are in greater need for all kinds of services and frankly aren't purely provided through schools. And Chris talked about fundraising. I mean, Steps to Success is perpetually fundraising. They're not even fully paid for by the Brookline Public Schools. Right. And so, like that's what it takes to actually get kids out of poverty into and I don't want to knock Steps because I think Steps is a great program, does a great job. And it's not fully a Brookline invested thing. And so that's what worries me most, that we can keep building and it doesn't matter if what you build values at, our median house range. Like if you built it and it's going to cost like 1.7 million, I forget what the median is. Well, by doing that, you're outpricing most African American Latin families. That. So we could create more housing, but it doesn't help any of the other racial factors. And I would say it actually has a great impact towards the schools and how that works.
Thank you. Deborah, I want to get you in here, and I have actually a specific question for you that builds on Malcolm's comments about housing, actually. There's been a pitched debate over housing in Brookline with the development of new housing, especially where, how much, and how big as a central focus. In our survey, housing emerged as the top issue by far on the minds of Brookline residents, with 65% of respondents saying that affordable housing would be most helpful in creating pathways to help people get ahead economically, including majorities of owners and renters, as well as 82% supporting income-restricted housing and 74% supporting high-density housing. Meanwhile, 63% of respondents indicated support for rent control, including 87% of renters and 89% of Black and Latino respondents. In your view, are those levels of support reflected currently in our policymaking, and how could they be?
I think we all know the answer to that question. No, it's not. It's just not. And what would it look like to change the conversation? I hate to say it, but MBTA communities, pardon the background, folks, was a little chip at asking for greater housing density. The question is it going to be enough? You've got the governor's drive to, is it $5 billion for affordable housing? Some of that will go to Brookline. But one of the things that I want to say, some of the systemic or institutional barriers that I see come from how we choose leaders and what those leaders hear as priorities. And I think this will go a long way in changing some of the discourse around how people really value housing, and that and I'm going to say this, it's not just a black and white issue. It impacts everybody. And Malcolm is right. There has been a underinvestment in, just average, I call it average housing, but not Brookline version of average housing. And I do want to say that our little CDC is working really hard to change that dynamic. We've got a project now. It'll be 10 to 12 units, but these are going to be for home ownership. And our hope is that this is just the beginning of many, many, many more units, that we actually put a dent in it. But Raul, the real money can't just come from Brookline. It has to come from the state too. And when you look at state and federal policy, it leans against supporting affordable housing, especially home ownership in suburbs. If you're not a gateway city, you're going to have a hard time finding money to build, housing for sale. We hope to sell ours. I'll go out on a limb, maybe for $400,000 for people between 80 and 100% AMI. But, what's 12 units in this big C? Hopefully it changes the trend. Hopefully it gets the state to look at things differently. But those are the folks that, from a policy perspective, may be doing as much, if not more harm than Brookline leader. Or that's been my experience of late. Sorry about that.
No, all good. Thank you, Deborah. And by the way, I can't hear the background noise. I just hear you. So no worries. Okay. Hey, Chris, let's get you back in here. A majority of respondents said that racism is at least a somewhat serious problem in Brookline, including 68% of women and 70% of Black and Latino residents. According to an analysis by the American Public Health Association, which are the most recent past president, hundreds of communities nationally have declared racism to be a public health crisis, including just next door in Boston. Brookline has not made such a declaration. Is it time that we do? And what might be the impact of taking such a step?
So yeah, thanks for bringing APHA in. More information for us at apha.org. Join us, honestly, truly. For me, it's been an incredible opportunity to try to move the needle on health equity at a national level. We work at APHA to advocate for health equity across the nation, and also in many global spaces as well. So yeah, APHA, under the past president's leadership of Kamara Phyllis-Jones, who some of you might have heard of, she's an incredible public health leader, and she started this initiative looking at having municipalities, cities, towns, states, organizations declare racism as a public health crisis. Because she said, when you declare it, when a government or a city or a town says that, then they're acknowledging that there is real harm that racism causes to the health and well-being of the people, and that they don't just understand and acknowledge it, but they want to really be explicit about how they address it. So across the nation, since about 2016, we had a number of declarations, now over 250. So Brookline has not yet declared racism as a public health crisis. I've actually thought about a number of reasons why, maybe not. It could be that, we have 5 select board members and not one mayor that you could reach out to and say, hey, let's declare it. And Brookline is just, our government is trying to deal with a number of different priorities. So of course, I think it's time. I think it would be wonderful and great. But I guess I just want to point out and say that I don't think that Brookline, or at least the Brookline I want us to be, and it has been backed up by this survey results, Brookline is aware that racism is a public health crisis, is a real problem. Your survey results showed that. And I guess I also, in so many different ways, know and think that Brookline is working on it because of organizations like Bridge or the Brookline Community Foundation, BCF, or the fact that in so many places and spaces on convenings that I'm in Brookline, we have these land acknowledgements. We say them, we declare them, and we talk about them. There are a number of different places. And also, for example, the Brookline Health Department, under Segal Reese's amazing leadership, they're doing this huge CHIP, Community Health Improvement Plan, which many of you might be a part of and know. And in that place and space, they're doing just a really deep dive into what, let's figure out a plan, a strategic plan that can work on improving the health of the community. But in that huge, there's multiple planning sessions, reports, they have plans for monitoring and evaluation. The health department is also really making explicit when they're doing this, that they're looking at health equity, and they talk about racial equity. And in this plan, this CHIP plan, this community health improvement plan, they're clear and explicit in our health department, also under the guidance with HRIA, Health Resources in Action, of ensuring that they're incorporating a racial equity focus. And so I guess to say, yes, of course, let's declare racism a public health crisis in Brookline. Anyone in the town, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to be your liaison to APHA. But yeah, I think we know it. I think we just are not sure of how to address it as a community, to work together in one, really solid movement on it. I think people I think Deborah was saying was, or maybe it was Steve, people vote and feel this way, but then they also don't maybe want to do rent control or something like that. We're not sure about how to get to the end goal, but they're doing it. Our health department is trying to do it. It's embedded in a lot of what we do, but is it time? Of course. I don't think I am confident and hopeful that our select board and our town meeting would be happy to declare that racism is a public health crisis, because they know the data shows that.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'll say I think you and I both feel strong leadership coming from the public health department right now. In fact, Segal Reese, the director, is with us tonight. The question I think really is going to be, are the results of that CHIP work, are the results of the gap analysis that's also happening around social services, are the results of all of this going to lead to more funding and changes in policy? And that is squarely in the purview of town meeting and the select board, and of course the town administrator as well. Erica's got a good question, by the way. Have those questions come in anytime. We'll interject them, or we'll take some at the end, about how residents can help to have them, like the town, declare racism as a public health crisis if there is a way. It seems that there's two pathways. One is to have the select board take that on their own. Another pathway is to have that go through town meeting. And so there are a couple different pathways for that to happen. I think in order for it to happen, residents are going to have to come together and really say that that's something that they want. And again, the declaration itself, or resolution itself, has I think little impact. It's what kinds of resources and actions are going to be connected to that declaration that I think is where the rubber hits the road. Yeah. So thanks for that, Erica. Malcolm, let's talk about education a little bit. 46% of respondents rated the public schools of Brookline as either good or fair in actively working to reduce racial disparities. That's the highest of any group polled, yet data show persistent racial and ethnic disparities in academic achievement, advanced course enrollment, and overall educational outcomes in Brookline. Meanwhile, our survey showed a stark racial gap in support for unleveled classes, with 60% of Black and Latino residents indicating support for changing to unleveled courses at Brookline High School, compared to support from just 36% of Asian and 37% of white residents. What do you make of the disparities in these data, and where do you think we need to focus our efforts to close the racial gaps in opportunities and outcomes?
Yeah, thanks for this. So I have a few thoughts. I'll try and keep them really concise. I think one of the first things that I thought about in that polling number is that we didn't actually ask kids that question, right? So I don't want to speak for the 0 to 18, 19 in Brookline or attend Brookline Public Schools. My bet is that number would be different, actually. And I think it's really easy as adults to kind of get the glimpses, and particularly in my experience where I dealt with teenagers, I mean, you're lucky if you even know what book they're reading in English class, like let alone like you'll hear about a thing and it sounds really diverse and like they're addressing a lot. And I would be curious if kids would reinforce such numbers as much as their caregivers and the ones who did the survey. I think, though, that is actually important. I think Brookline has always wanted to see itself as good. And I think, very few of those 0 to 18 are the ones moving here. And so if the adults believe their kids are getting education that promotes equity and other things like that, I actually think that's really important. I think like that perception is something that is probably helping keep all parents and caregivers around a little bit more. And so I think that's actually a really important finding, but I would be super curious to know about students. I think what belies that is sort of the insidious thing around how racism works. This is what's sort of ringing with, some of the questions earlier. Like, it's one thing to think you're good. It's one thing to think the schools are good. It's another thing when the rubber meets the road. And just this past spring, Brookline High School wanted to de-level 9th grade English. So instead of trying to guess and gauge from all the 8 elementary schools, you come in and everybody would take the same English class. There was huge pushback on that. And I think a lot of that comes from sort of the nature of schools. Schools actually have not changed very much. I mean, we still have summer break for summer harvest, for crying out loud. And nobody really does that very often. I taught in Iowa and kids didn't need a break for summer harvest. But I think the perceptions of the world do change. So now we're post Brown versus Board of Ed, where most everybody who's walking has seen that difference. We forget that ushering in of particularly leveling in and around that integration of schools dynamic. It is in essence a way to resegregate schools when you can't force kids to not go into the school. And there's a real fear that I think is actually quite ironic and just frankly kind of funky. Like, there's an idea that if our kids don't take these high-level classes, they won't get into schools. We actually don't have any real evidence of that. I would also contend that high school is the only place in education we really do that, particularly in Brookline, but even in a lot of places in around Massachusetts. I mean, sometimes you get a true middle school and they do some leveling, but it's really there. Like, you go to college and everybody takes the same class. You go to law school, everybody takes the same class. You go to medical school, everybody takes the same class. And all of a sudden we are fixated on this, I think mostly because we think our children are going to lose if they cannot be in said classes. And that is really problematic. And it is really rooted in a racist thing, despite people thinking they're good and despite people thinking this is what they want, but also not realizing because the school that they've known most of their lives and through their is this idea of leveling. And so because of that, we tend to think the way we went to school is the right way to do it, as opposed to understanding for the better part of education, and particularly in a place or in and around Boston, Boston Latin didn't start off with level classes. They just didn't let anybody go in there. None of us on this screen could have gone there. And so, that's the real funky issue. And I would just like to point, particularly at a school like Brookline High, where we have already said our kids are advanced. 90% of American high school students start in Algebra 1. Brookline High School only offers one section for about 20 kids of Algebra 1. All 9th graders start in geometry. That's saying we're advanced. All 9th graders take physics. That happens for less than 15% of the kids in the United States in public schools and private schools. That's saying we're advanced. We already do the things that say we're advanced. We don't need leveling to do it. But I think there's a lot of people who actually feel my child will lose out. So I'm all about integration. I'm all about having these other things. But if my child will lose out and not be able to get into the school that I think they should go to, or that I want them to, or that I donate money to, or any of those other things, well, yeah, you can't do that. You can't do that. I'll say all these other, but you can't actually then now limit my child, which again, there's actually no real evidence to prove that. And so that, that's kind of thing. And I think, as someone who taught particularly a senior mixed level class, where I had kids who as juniors took APUS and kids who were coming out of English learner and some small group special education, all in that same room, that was a much richer class than any of the leveled classes I taught at Brookline. We should be wanting our kids in, excuse me, heterosexual groupings in their classes. It will make for better people and a much richer educational experience.
Thanks for that, Malcolm. I'm gonna take Leslie's good question, by the way, being what the heck are unleveled classes, which I hope she got most of through your response to my question. And very briefly, I'll say that as Malcolm indicated, throughout the K-8, there aren't really no levels of classes. You take a class, everyone's in it. And then when you arrive in high school, there are sometimes these honors level, and then what are sometimes called either standard level or college prep. Sometimes they're called classes, which are at a different level. And the real debate here seems to be proponents of having these leveled courses say that they want and we're talking about folks, the parents here now, and maybe students as well, that there's more rigor in honors level courses when they are leveled in that way, and opponents of leveling in that way will say, well, that what we see clearly, I mean, you can literally look into a classroom and based on the racial composition of that classroom, namely whether or not there are Black or Latino students in that class, know whether or not it's an honors level or a standard level course, and advocates pushing for what I have in my classroom at Boston University. Also, I teach a number of courses at the graduate level, and we don't have any leveled classes. You're all in there. Some of them come in knowing very little about the topic. Others come in knowing a whole lot about the topic, and they're all in the same place. And so anyway, so that's essentially the debate around those classes.
Raul, if I could just add one last thing, particularly around that. For a long time, and particularly in this town, it actually was very little to do with race. It was actually mostly around the Irish families that moved in. We had basic or basal, from older times. And in the early 2000s, we had basal still in English and math. We just got rid of it. We said, just put them in standard. And now nobody knows the difference 20 years later. And this is what I mean. Like it's something we should realize at this point we do not need anymore, and never really did need it.
Thanks. I'm going to sort of elevate Piper's comment. Well said, Malcolm. I wonder what the children of color, Black and brown in particular, would say about the racial disparities and their experiences, as you mentioned. And how about the Black and brown adults who may not live in Brookline but work in the town? What might they say about the disparities? Important to note here is that the responses that we received to our survey were from Brookline residents, notably absent. And by the way, Brookline residents over 18 or the age of or older, right? There's probably for good reason we don't want to be sending mail to young children asking to complete surveys. However, we don't have responses from anyone who's under the age of 18. And we don't have responses from folks who may have a stake in Brookline in some meaningful way but don't live here. And we certainly don't have responses from folks who might want to live in Brookline were it more affordable, or if we address some of these other issues we're talking about as well. So know that those are the limitations in terms of the data that we have right now, and it's important, I think, to note that as well. I want to move on to the issue around childcare and pre-K, and with unfortunately, I don't know that Deborah's with us anymore. I think Deborah, oh, she may be back here. So Deborah, if you're here and can come on, please come on camera. If not, we'll invite our other panelists to jump in here. After housing, affordable childcare and universal pre-K ranked second and third as interventions that would be most helpful in creating pathways to help people get ahead economically. How critical to addressing affordability are these policies, and how might they serve to help close the racial gaps in opportunities and outcomes, which we just discussed? Let me see. Not seeing Deborah on right now. Chris, do you want to jump in here and talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, happy to do so. So years ago, I served on the Brookline Commission for Women, which is still an incredible commission. And we looked at childcare. I remember we created a document, our commissioners looking at what are the options for childcare in Brookline, just so that people knew and had a place to just go through, kind of like a mini yellow pages for childcare, because it was hard. And that was years ago. It's harder now. The cost of childcare is crushing to families. I know a number in particular of women who stepped out of the workforce because of the cost of childcare, and or just, I mean, let's face it, I have 3 kids. Like, they finish school on some days at 2:30, but other days at 1:40. And then they have parent-teacher conferences and holiday. I mean, it is just not made for someone who has to work, say, a shift schedule outside the home. It is really hard. And we saw this and we learned about it, and everyone was like up in arms and angry about it during the pandemic when everyone had to care for their own kids. And we realized this. I mean, people were like, childcare is a crisis. It was all over the news. And then the pandemic is, quote, over, and people, their history, they just forgot, right? And everyone's kind of back to that, quote, normal, which was terrible. We need to really look at addressing it in Brookline. I don't think there's a day that goes by where people are coming into Brookline who say, what do I do about after school care? I remember the Brookline Community Foundation had convenings that looked at out of school time and how that is critically one of the most dangerous times for children in their day. And we convened everyone from the rec department to the select board to town, I mean, just everybody in schools. And everyone was like gung-ho. 3 hours later, we're going to solve this. And nothing has happened. If anything, I think it's harder, and after school care programs are more disparate. And we are trying. I think people want to do it and they know we need to do it, but there's no momentum and organization to get it done. But the thing is, and I remember working with Vicki Milstein, who used to be the principal of BEEP years ago. She said, if we can get universal pre-K and better childcare options for our families here in Brookline, then we can be a model and do it for so many other places and spaces across the nation. Truly, because we don't have that gap to fill. I mean, if we can just really address this, but it would be a game changer for all of those families. And honestly, this goes to other things of why in your survey of why we don't have a lot of representation in our town meeting, why Asian Americans aren't represented. Because I don't know about you, but I've got 3 kids. I used to be a town meeting member. I'm still a library trustee, but I've got 3 kids, and to give up multiple evenings to sit in town meeting, potentially in a high school auditorium, not to mention all the other things that I would want to do to be a really good town meeting member, to be engaged in my community. I have 3 kids to feed, work to do, right? It's hard. So we need to really address that. It's something that we can do. We know we need to do. There just needs to be that connection. And what we need to realize is, aside from it very much hurting the families and those parents, and therefore our productivity and input in the business and work world, it's really hurting those children. You know, those kids that are not gainfully engaged in any way, that are losing all this time in the summer, that, you know, are getting shuffled around and not being able to do all these, you know, great after school programs because either they can't get to them, or they can't pay for them, or maybe, you know, the town's trying to do a lot, and I really applaud that, but it's not enough. Like, it's wonderful that we're going to, you know, maybe pay for registration fees for different sports and different activities like that. But who covers the trips to different meets? Who covers the equipment, the sneakers? Who takes the kids to the soccer practices here, there, and everywhere? I mean, my goodness, I feel like half my day is spent trying to coordinate carpool with a number of parents, just so that all of us who work can make sure our kids are getting there wherever that may be and back again. So yeah, it's I have a lot more to say, but I will obviously defer to Deborah too.
Yeah. I'll note that I just put in the chat the link to the 2019 BCF out of school time report. APHA Taylor, the executive director of the Brookline Community Foundation, is with us tonight. Thanks for being here. You know, I also want, you know, to talk about two things here. One is childcare, and then also the universal pre-K as well. A couple of years ago, I was paneled in a jury, and I sat on a trial, the details of which I won't go into because they were terrible. But I was able to get a glimpse into what the gaps really look like in childcare. And this is a immigrant family who really were making below minimum wage in the jobs that they were doing, didn't have a lot of money for childcare, and basically just had somebody watching their kid. At best, they were sat in front of a TV all day, right? The gap between that and the kind of childcare that I'm able to get for my daughter right now, because I can pay for it. The gap between those two, and year over year, how that impacts their ability to learn even before school starts, is huge later on. There was a school committee member, I remember during the debate around the leveling, unleveling, you know, who said that we're so far down the river at this point. We're talking about how to address these disparities at 9th grade. And it doesn't mean that that's not an important conversation, but we need to be talking about how to address these disparities even before school begins, and certainly when it does begin. I've heard our superintendent, Linus Guillory, talk about working to bring universal pre-K to Brookline. What I haven't yet heard is a plan to do it. And I'm hoping that we can join and be part of that conversation as well.
And sorry,
Chris, yeah.
I need to add that, just in case, and I don't really know the composition of the folks who are attendees right now, and then I don't know who's going to watch this in recording later. But, you know, my experience is just my lived experience. But the people that I interact with, there is a huge stark inequities between, like, I have some folks who can provide great after school meaningful program where their kids can learn to do all sorts of things, and robotics and Russian math. So don't even worry about the leveling issue, Malcolm. They've got Russian math, and apparently there's Japanese math. There's all these other maths that I didn't know existed when I was a kid. I just thought math was math, but it's not anymore. And they can do all of these great things. But then there are the other children, many in Brookline, that you don't see because they're stuck at home, hopefully with maybe something to do, but likely maybe not, right? They don't have access to the internet because some public housing doesn't have free Wi-Fi, for example. They don't have a Chromebook or a $1,000 iPhone and a plan that covers that. They can't participate in all these great after school activities because often those cost money, or maybe they can get that fee waived, but they don't have all the other supplies to really participate fully. And I know as a child that can feel really embarrassing and awkward. There are the children who are getting the Thrive backpacks, that are getting this. I mean, I love the fact that everyone can get school lunches now, because that really, I think, has changed the dynamics in the cafeteria and just sort of in school in general. But a lot of kids, they have to go there early for breakfast as well. And not everyone's doing that, for example. I think we just are not realizing this. Even when school starts, there are so many amazing organizations. I think Rotary, the police department, the Brookline Community Foundation, so many organizations that literally just try to create backpacks with school supplies for kids because they can't afford school supplies. And then into the winter, the kids club clothes comes in to give these children winter coats and boots because the kids in Brookline, they don't all have them. Some of them have the really nice $1,000 super awesome Canada Goose, but not everyone does. And this is what I think we need to really understand. It's not just about leveling and de-leveling. It's about, and not about me losing something. It's about making sure other people are whole and can live with dignity and to live their fullest. So that's just a bit, sorry. I get all caught up.
Thanks, Chris. No, it's important to understand too what we're talking about. And you know, I don't use the term low income people. I say underpaid. The vast majority of people who we're talking about are actually the working poor. It was actually the song that folks entered to was a song by a guy named Fantastic Negrito, and the song's called Working Poor. Now there are people who can't work either because, well, they're kids or because they have a disability or for other reasons. But the vast majority of people we're talking about are actually working. They're doing what either people say they should do or what we want or need them to do, right? Who among us wants to go to a restaurant, feed ourselves after cooking the meal, and then go wash the dishes afterwards, right? We want to be able to go out into these places, and we also need people to drive the trains and do all other kinds of things. The sad reality is that those people, particularly in places where costs are increasing, where folks are rent burdened, like in Brookline, and are struggling even to provide meals for themselves and their families, those folks are working. They're doing things. They're doing all the things that they're supposed to, that folks say they're supposed to do, and they're underpaid for their work. And even as their wages go up, if costs go up, we just become middle people where the checks come to us and we just send them somewhere else to someone else. And so, you know, this is we see this affordability crisis all over the data from this survey. And we've got to treat it like the crisis that it is, whether or not that's happening in other communities. And that shouldn't make us feel any better about what's happening in Brookline right now. And it really needs to be treated like the crisis that it is. Relative to that, Malcolm, I wanted to ask you, you know, local government leaders had nearly the lowest favorables with respect to addressing racial disparities, second only to the business community, with just 30% of respondents ranking local government leaders as excellent or good at actively working to reduce disparities. They also had the highest unfavorables overall, including 28% of AAPI residents and 25% of Black and Latino residents saying local government leaders are doing poorly at actively working to reduce racial disparities. I'm wondering what you make of these numbers and what our select boards, school committee, town meeting members, and other electeds could do to better address these concerns in your view.
All right. So I think I'll focus mostly on school committee in this way. It just, you know, just to minimize, you know, my response to the question. Big shout out to Dr. Smith Mumford. I've known for a very long time, since I was a young man, not even a young man, I'd say a teenage boy. So thanks for that. But I think one of the things I've really noticed about school committee is, you know, you don't see them. You know, I think about particularly early on in my career when I was coaching and other things. You know, as school committee members who would come shake my hand at Thanksgiving Day football games while I was coaching. Rest of soul, Marcia Heist, who used to come with her mobility impaired partner to my girls' basketball games, came to state tournament games. I used to see them at progressions at the high school, at the town 7th and 8th grade basketball championships and things like that. And I don't see them. And I should actually see them more often in my new position, as opposed to where I was at the high school for 24 years. Now as METCO director, I go into all 9 schools. And maybe I see them on voting day, but I don't see them at a play or at something else. You know, I'm sure if I go to the steps gala on the 20, I think it's on the 22nd. I'll see some of them there. Are they really interacting with children and seeing what's there and like recognizing, some of the actually going into a classroom and seeing like the dearth or the total miss of not having any books of color on the shelf of a classroom. Looks like authored by people of color. And I would say that answer is no. And so, yeah, it's nice that you're on school committee, but if you're asking me if I trust that you really know what's going on in our schools to implement things that would improve racial disparities, that answer is no. And really, more importantly, it gives the impression that it's not of value either. And so that would be my first thing to do. Like, you signed up for this, you ran an election, you found campaign money for this, find some time to get in there. And I'm not saying it's easy. Chris just went on a whole rightfully so tirade about like people working and not being able to get, well, you know what? Then maybe you shouldn't be on school committee. If you can't find time to go hear some second and third graders or eighth graders do their oral presentations on different stuff and go see the eighth grade play that's in your school district, I don't know what to tell you. Like, you're never going to really understand all those things. And, I think about this in a lot of ways because when you go see those 7th and 8th grade plays, some schools are really good where they just include everybody. But even then, when you look at who ends up being on stage, it's not going to be the kids of color. It's not going to be the kids who those families can't do it. I mean, maybe they'll get them to help with like other things that are really valuable to the play. But you'll go and see it and you'll ask the question and you'll wonder why. I literally had a conversation this morning. A parent was talking about how inaccessible the PTO was at this school. And that's because they were holding meetings at 8:10 in the morning. Well, no, like you're going to get a very select group of people there. And this is why there's those who say things haven't gotten better, because my mother made the same argument for what was then called the devotion PTO in 1976, because they were holding meetings at noon. And she went in there and said, yeah, you're not going to get any women. And she said, the only reason I can come for this little bit of time is because I got babies right now. As soon as they get old enough, I'm not coming. And so I don't think there isn't enough show, right? Kids know it's important if you show up. And so do the teachers, and they all recognize it. I know those girls from 2003 will remember Marcia Heiss being at our games because she used to come up and tell them how good they were. They'll remember it. And those kids are darn near 40 now. They'll remember it. But I tell my staff all the time, your absence is as recognized as your presence. And so when you're not there, that's noticed as well.
I'll say too, in terms of being in places and spaces, I'd say also, being in places and spaces where folks of color are in community as well, or knowing who we are and where we are. I can't tell you the number of times when I've seen an elected official say, I don't know, we just couldn't find any people of color to serve on this committee. And for some reason, every committee I've ever created in Brookline, we found a way to have significant numbers, including majorities of people of color on various committees. And so it really speaks to, I think, some of the racial gaps that we have in Brookline. It is, I believe people when they say they don't know, they just don't know anybody. I don't believe them when they say they couldn't find anybody who was qualified, because there are a ridiculous number of qualified folks in our community. We had an event in March and with any number of panelists of color who are experts in their field. We have an event tonight with folks who are experts in their field. There's no shortage of folks from communities of color that could serve in elected and appointed positions in Brookline. There is, it seems, a gap in folks' ability who are currently in office to actually connect with those folks, to understand who they are and provide pathways for them to get involved in community, and that's something we should certainly address as well. We've only got a few minutes left. I want to see if I can get just a quick answer to one final question, and then I just have some very brief closing remarks. I'll also invite you to check out in the chat Chris sharing some really important information about upcoming events as well. So final question for y'all. Majorities of respondents strongly support shifting resources and increasing taxes to make more affordable, to make housing more affordable, to address food insecurity and expand childcare options. For affordable housing, 84% support shifting resources, 76% support increasing taxes. Food insecurity, 86% support shifting resources, 79% support increasing taxes. And for expanding childcare, 86% support shifting resources, 77% support increasing taxes. These are strong majorities that hold for every demographic, which really indicate widespread support to use our municipal budget and to raise revenue to address these affordability concerns. I'm wondering what you make of these numbers, and what we should be doing about it. And we can go, Chris, Malcolm. We'll go maybe just very brief answers, and I got to close this thing out.
I'll let Malcolm go first because I have problems with brevity.
Thanks, Chris. No pressure. Yeah, I would go back to my point around leveling. I think it's really easy to say that on a survey until the people who perceive themselves to be in power are losing something. And so I think if shifting money is one thing, but if their property taxes are going to go up, well, no way. Like, we have people who don't want to help rebuild the school that hadn't had a renovation for over 50 years. Like, I mean, were we supposed to function with just 7 schools? Like, again, I'm I think it's real easy to say that until you feel like you're losing something. I would agree. I don't know what that would mean we'd lose in terms of other services, and that's what would scare me most. Like, are we just moving papers around, or are we actually like really at the heart taking care of things and thinking about where perhaps we don't need the same investment as perhaps we once did? And I don't know that we've really thought that through in a way that's there. And again, I think Brookline people like to say they're on the good side of things. And so, yeah, especially in a blind survey where I can't go up and say, Malcolm, now's the time to do whatever. I worry. I worry that people will then see that as an actual loss for them. So,
well, Malcolm, when we find out what's real is when we put it on the ballot. People have got to go out there and vote. And one of the things, thankfully, we have seen folks go out there and vote to fund, renovation of schools, much needed renovation of schools. But we haven't really tested on the ballot supporting the kinds of social programs that are showing strong support in the survey that we put out there in the field. Chris?
So as brief as I can be, I am really optimistic about what we can do in Brookline, because the survey results shows that there is all of this support. And we have done really hard things in Brookline. Now we're one of the first, and it's starting to catch on like wildfire, the whole tobacco-free generation now because of what we did at town meeting. We're amongst the first to ban plastic bags, right? And now you'd be hard-pressed to get them at many stores. Free menstrual products in our public restrooms. There's a number of things that we've done in Brookline that at many times people would be like, why would we ever do that if you first mentioned it? And now I don't see smoking in any restaurants or places, right? We can do these hard things. Our support is there. I think we just need to figure out a way to get out of our way of what am I going to lose or you're going to lose, and think about what are our wins? What are our wins as a community? The wins would be that women, men, folks can work and get paid, gainfully employed, and feel like a really productive, giving member of society, while their children are well fed and educated to the best of their abilities. And we can live in a community where people do not have to wait in a line somewhere to get food, where our elder citizens can live in dignity, right? And so these are the things that we all want and we can do. And as a nation, it's it's hard too, but we've done hard things. We have the Affordable Care Act, right? I mean, we can do so much more, and I know many of us want to. But that's what I'm saying is the data show that people want it. We just need to figure out how to get, for lack of a better word, all of our oars rowing in the same direction as a town. Because we've got the smarts, we've got the talent, and I know that we have the heart. Because for every person who wants this town to be a city, there's someone who wants it to be a town. And just, we are so enthusiastic and in it. We just have to harness this energy to make sure that everyone, no matter who they love, the color of their skin, their age, their race, that they can live with dignity and grace, and have food, that no one needs to get a winter coat from a charity. That's what we want. We can do it, right? So let's take this energy, let's vote, let's get others to vote. And then also let's really support our candidates and the people who want to volunteer in these different places and spaces and give, truly give, so that we can move the needle on all of these different places and spaces. Give of your time and treasure. I think we can do it.
There's the optimistic Chris that we all know and love. I'll say we're an optimistic group at Bridge. I mean, we believe that we can eliminate racism in our community and that we can do it if everybody else believes it too. And so we're going to be working hard to get that done. I just want to say thanks to you all for sharing your time and insights with us today. Thanks to Deborah as well, who popped in while literally at airports and doing all kinds of wild stuff. So thanks to her. Thanks to Steve Gazella and Olivia Wine from the MassINC Polling Group. Thanks to our friends Steve, Heather, and the rest of the team from Brookline Interactive Group. And thanks for everyone for attending tonight. As we close, I just want to invite everyone to review the data for themselves and to think about how you could partner with us and others to address the affordability crisis and the multitude of racial inequities in our community. As a reminder to the elected officials out there, 89% of respondents indicated that they are voters. I imagine they'll be watching closely to see how you respond to these data. We at Bridge certainly will be. So thanks to everybody. One final reminder, it's in the chat there, to support us in any way that you can, including by donating at bridge.org/donate. Do what you can. You see us around the neighborhood, check in with us. If you want to volunteer, reach out to me at raul@bridge.org. Love to get you involved in volunteering or supporting in some other way. And otherwise, look forward to seeing you around the neighborhood soon. We'll be in touch. Take care. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, Malcolm and Raul and Steve and Big.
Thank you. If you go to bridge.org right now, this video is already up there. So share with others, invite them to watch it as well. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.